Good morning, everybody. Grace and peace to all of you this morning. If you would please stand for the reading of Scripture. It comes from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 2, verses 1 through 7. These are the words of the Lord. In those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. This was the first registration when Quirinius was governor of Syria. And all went to be registered, each to his own town. And Joseph also went up from Galilee, from the town of Nazareth, to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David, to be registered with Mary, his betrothed, who was with child. And while they were there, the time came for her to give birth. And she gave birth to her firstborn son, and wrapped him in swaddling clothes, and laid him in a manger, because there was no place for them in the inn. These are the words of the Lord. Praise be to God. Please be seated. Since the scientific revolution, man has been obsessed, we might say, with how things work and with what they are made of, which is to say, which is what Aristotle referred to as efficient and material causes, which is in its essence a prioritization of what we might call predictive knowledge, the ability to predict what the natural world will do. And the power of this kind of knowledge is it allows man to be able to harness the power of nature. If you know what it's going to do, if you know what Mother Nature is going to do, you can then harness her power. Pre-modern man pre-modern observers of the cosmos, on the other hand, focus more upon what are called teleological questions, asking about the meaning and purpose of the universe, contemplating the higher spiritual truths that the physical phenomena embody, seeking not so much to control the cosmos as to be conformed to it. Now, in the classical conception, that of the Greco-Roman world, the cosmos itself was believed to be divine. And thus man's purpose as a microcosmos, as a mini-cosmos, was to conform his soul to the order that he found in the observable universe. The Greek word for this is theoria. You might think of theoretical or theory, but theoria is this idea of contemplation of the cosmos, which then would lead one to conform himself to it. You see the order in the cosmos, and so you try to order your soul in a similar way. And this was an understanding which was greatly enhanced by Christian theology, where it was revealed that it's not the universe which is divine, but rather its creator, and that the order of the cosmos is a reflection of his glory, and it is in his majesty that we are to conform ourselves as we contemplate it. Just as Paul says in 2 Corinthians, where we behold the glory of God as shown in the face of Jesus Christ, at which time we are then conformed to his image from one degree of glory to another. Now, pre-modern cultures communicated these kinds of theological and anthropological insights, not through scientific treatises, of course, but through story and myth and song. As scholar Malcolm Guite has observed, the wisdom of the previous age was rooted in the idea that fables, stories, and myths were the medium that most completely embodied the deepest truths we need to know. Again, here he's talking about the truths that concern the meaning and purpose of the universe. Not what something is made out of or how it works, but why it is, what its purpose is. Guite continues, thus most of the wisdom of the ancient world, both Judeo-Christian and classical, was embodied in myth, story, and song. The notion of telling a fable in order to get at a truth went very deep. In the Christian view, stories, songs, and myths are not just window dressing, in other words, window dressing for propositional truths, we might say. They're not just there for entertainment value, to adorn the facts so that we might be more inclined to pay attention to them. In other words, something that just can be dispensed with and we can just talk about these propositional truths. No, they are actually absolutely essential, for they communicate meaning in a way that other forms of truth-bearing cannot. And yet, at the same time, these are not just stories in the Christian conception. And this is one of the things that makes Christianity different. These are not just stories, these are not just myths, but these are stories which are rooted in history. They are myths which have become fact. Now, it's not only modernism, of course, which has sought to undermine this mythological form of truth-telling, but also radical postmodernism. For it approaches these stories with an envious cynicism that aims to undermine their integrity, their facticity, you might say, by besmirching the motives of the writer as nothing more than an attempt to maintain dominance and an unjust hierarchy of some kind. That these individuals just made up these stories so that they could oppress people. Kate Millett, who is a seminal figure in the women's liberation movement, is just one example of this kind of resentful reading. For she sees, for example, the sin of Eve in Genesis 3 as a pernicious and conscious attempt by the male authors to vilify women and keep them under the thumb of the patriarchy. And you can just imagine what she would have to say about the oppression of Mary concerning the whole situation of Jesus' birth. An example of divine rape, no doubt. And Mary's Magnificat, which we see in Luke chapter 1, which is her hymn of praise at the announcement of the Messiah's coming, at the announcement that the Messiah will come through her womb, you might think demonstrates that she doesn't view herself as being oppressed in this situation, but rather the opposite of that which is blessed. Which is, if you think about the two ways in which you can face reality, you can either face reality thinking that you're oppressed, or you can face reality and thinking that you are blessed. The one leads to resentment, the other, of course, leads to gratitude. So you might look at this hymn of praise and say, well, Mary clearly sees herself as blessed. But the postmodern response to that would be as, well, if that in fact did occur, I mean, it could just be, again, the male writers are making this up as propaganda. But even if it did occur, we should dismiss it, because such exploited joy only demonstrates that Mary has internalized her oppression. This embittered deconstruction of the narrative, this undermining of its genuineness and its trustworthiness, abolishes any hope of a true reading. And so what you might say is that what modernism tries to do is undermine the mythical, and what postmodernism tries to do is undermine the factual. But in order for the biblical texts to accomplish what they were intended to accomplish, we need to read them in a way that brings these two aspects together. We must read them as history, yes, but also as myth, as a story which reveals to us the deepest truths, but also ones which are rooted in fact, that are rooted in history. As an example of this, we can think about the fact that we see in verses 4 and 7 of the reading that say that Jesus was born in the town of Bethlehem. A fact which connects this event that's taking place in the first century back to the prophecy of Micah, which is 6 or 7 centuries before this, a prophecy which concerns the birthplace of the new David. King David, we are told, was born in Bethlehem, and the prophet tells us that his successor will be born there as well. This comes in Micah chapter 5, verse 2. But you, O Bethlehem Ephrathah, you who are too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to be ruler in Israel, whose coming forth is from of old, from ancient days. So the prophet here predicting that the new David, the Messiah, the king from ancient days, which is a divine reference there. This person who will come to once and for all vanquish the enemies of Israel, which, by the way, is a story which has consoled the nation for millennia. It consoled them through the wandering in the wilderness and during the Babylonian captivity, and even now during the current Roman occupation. This is the joy that was set before them, this story of the coming of the new David who would set the captives free. The prophet here is saying that this mythical figure of the Messiah will be born in Bethlehem. And so by simply stating the location of Jesus' birth, Luke is confirming that this story concerning the new David, this myth, which has been passed down generation after generation has now become fact. So to fully appreciate what's going on in Luke's historical account, we have to put it in its larger narrative context, in the context of mythology, which is the story of redemption that comes through the Jewish Messiah. We have to put it in Israel's mythos, that story which has defined them, as I said, for thousands of years. A story that not only imbues the world with great meaning and purpose, and as we said, consolation, bringing good news of great joy that will be for all people, as it says a few verses later in chapter 2. But it's one which also provides us a narrative by which we can guide our lives. It gives us a story that we can inhabit, which, as we've said in the past, is essential for us because we are by nature narratival creatures, we might say. Creatures who conceive of the world and live in it through story. And if you've never thought about that before, take some time to reflect upon the way you view the world and the way you view your life. It is a story, is how you see it, with a beginning and a middle and an end. You are headed towards some goal, some ultimate end you're striving towards. And the ultimate question is, will you arrive at that goal or will you not? Now, having made the case, although briefly, for the necessity of affirming both the mythical and the factual, let me say that there are times when the church has failed to maintain a proper balance between these two. And when such a mistake occurs, if it is widely adopted, it can undermine the mythical or the historical veracity of these foundational texts. And it also has the potential to shape our hearts and minds in ways other than was originally intended. This is especially the case, I think, when the church embraces what we could call a mythical overreach, or an adopting of a telling of the story or the myth which is not rooted in fact, which is ahistorical, an interpretation which goes beyond what the text supports. In church history, such emendations have too often been cherished beliefs. That's what they often become. And this is the case either due to their poetic potency or maybe just their familiarity because they've been passed down generation after generation. And thus they can appear to people even more meaningful than the truth itself. They can seem more true than the actual story. And as a result, believers are reluctant to let these features of their story go. And it makes preachers like myself reticent to expose their falsity. Because unlike the modernists or the postmodernists, I don't want to dilute the potency of these stories. On the contrary, I want to thicken them. So it can be dangerous business debunking factual errors which have become cherished beliefs and also important features of the redemption narrative, because I don't want to provoke people into starting to question the narrative in its entirety. On the other hand, though, Christianity, as we said, is rooted in history. And thus its potency will be diminished if we refuse to rigorously maintain both its mythical and factual status. The myth must be true, and the true must be mythical, you might say. Or ultimately, neither will be of value to us. And this is a lesson that our civilization is learning, and learning in a very bitter way. As we said, postmodernism has tried to free the myth from fact, while modernism before that tried to free the facts from the myth. Both of those projects have failed miserably, and the consequences of that failure are all around us. The solution is to hold the two aspects together, and that's exactly what Christianity does. It provides a mythos that has the ability to satisfy one's heart entirely. It is the greatest story, as many people have noted, that has ever been told. But at the same time, the story is true. It is rooted in reality. Jordan Peterson, I think one of the reasons why Peterson has been able to point people to Christ, and I think present the beauty of Christ, which is probably the most important thing to do at the moment, but he's able to depict the beauty of Christ in such a vivid way. And in part, you can see the struggle within him as he expresses this struggle that he has, which is the idea of the Logos, as he speaks about, right? The divine Logos, this great myth that underlies every other myth, right? The great character that is in every story, going back as far as is recorded, that this myth, I mean, imagine what it would be like, this myth that tells you who you are and speaks to you on this profoundly deep level. Imagine for a moment if that Logos became flesh. Imagine if the myth became fact, what that would mean. Living as we are in the twilight of modernism and postmodernism, this is the aspect of the gospel. And maybe this is true always, but this really seems to be the aspect of the gospel we have to highlight. That it brings together these two essential parts. If you just have the myth and it doesn't align with reality, it won't be enough, because at the end of the day, it's just a lie. But if you try just to look at things through facts, of course, it will not. We won't have a story in which to live and to embody and the rest of it. So in the spirit then of strengthening, or maybe we say protecting our mythos, let me debunk a commonly held fact about the narrative of Jesus' birth, and it has to do with the barn dominium as was described on the sheet. So the way the traditional story is told, as one writer put it, goes something like this. Joseph and Mary arrive at sleepy Bethlehem in the middle of the night. Mary, already in labor, remains on the donkey while Joseph frantically searches for a room at local inns. Desperate, he begs one reluctant innkeeper for any place at all to rest because his wife is about to give birth. The innkeeper finally relents and makes room for them in a tumble-down stable occupied by cattle. We all know this story. It is so familiar to us. We've watched and participated in its reenactment likely hundreds of times. For how many Christmas plays have we seen or been a part of which feature Joseph pounding on doors trying to find suitable shelter, only for each of them to be slammed in his face, or for every sign to read no vacancy, having then to settle for this stable on the outskirts of town? Or how many Christmas hymns have we sung which tell the same tale, like the hymn Once in Royal David's City? One of the stanzas of it is, once in Royal David's city stood a lowly cattle shed where a mother laid her baby in a manger for his bed. Or again, He shall reign forevermore, one of the great hymns, part of which says, in the bleak midwinter all creation groans for a world in darkness frozen like a stone. Light is breaking, a stable for a throne, and He shall reign forevermore, forevermore. As I said, that's one of the majestic hymns on this subject, and one that really captures the significance and joy of the King's birth. But again, in the middle of it, it tells this same narrative about the stable. And of course, there are the modern renditions of these classic hymns, some of which I hesitate to even call spiritual songs, like the nearly blasphemous yet ubiquitous No Room at the Inn, right? No room at the inn. All reservations were made in the spring. We're full to the brim. Sorry, we can't let you in. No room at the inn. We're fully booked and the party's in swing. Please pardon the din. Sorry, we can't let you in. Mary, Joseph, tell me what you're going to do. There's no way you'll be getting bed and breakfast for two. Yeah. Jesus being born in a lowly cattle shed is also the narrative depicted in every nativity scene and expressed on tens of millions of Christmas cards every year, as well as being the central theme of many Christmas sermons about the ostracism of the Son of God from human society, that His birth is taking place in a barn, for His people have no room in their hearth or their hearts for Him. This is Jesus as the refugee. And on we could go. And yet here's the thing. You see how dangerous it is what I'm about to say. But here's the thing, okay? Even given all of that, the idea that Mary and Joseph were outcasts from the community and relegated to a stable on the outskirts of town is both exegetically and culturally unlikely. I was hoping to preach this lesson sooner, a few weeks ago, before you'd gone to all the trouble of putting out the major scene. Although this tradition is so strong that this one sermon will likely be insufficient to cause repentance, right? And I don't mean that saying it's a sin. I have these same nativity manger scenes at my house. But the point is that Jesus very likely was not born in a stable. He was born in a house, surrounded by near relatives, just like everyone else. In other words, this aspect of the story is to teach you about how Jesus is like you, not how he is different than you. So where did the traditional story come from? And by the way, this is not new to me. This truth has been around a long time, but it has not caught on. As others have pointed out, there are at least two potential sources for the false narrative. One concerns issues of grammar and the meaning of one particular word in Luke 2, verse 2. And the second concerns ignorance of first century Palestinian culture. We plan to address both of these. The first issue, as I said, concerns the meaning of the Greek word kataluma in verse 2 of Luke 2. Many versions of the text still translate this word as in. Like the ESV, which you have in front of you, and she gave birth to her firstborn son and wrapped him in swaddling clothes and laid him in a manger because there was no place for them in the inn. Now, as Ian Paul points out in his essay on this topic, it's not that there isn't any reason for that translation, because the word that's used there is also used in the Septuagint, which is the ancient Greek translation of the Old Testament. And it's also the translation that the New Testament writers often cite. They often quote from the Septuagint. So that same word is used in the Septuagint, a Greek translation of the Old Testament, for a term that denotes a public place of hospitality, like an inn. For example, in 1 Samuel 9:22, it says, and of course this is translated into English, but and Samuel took Saul and his servant and brought them to the inn, that's kataluma, and set them there a place among the chief of those that were called about 70 men. So this is a public inn where they're going to go, and they're going to set them up there and pay for them to stay there. In addition to this, the word itself comes from the Greek word kataluo, which means to untie or to unloose, as to untie one's pack or unsaddle one's horse, like you would when you arrive after a long journey at an inn. However, there is strong evidence, very strong evidence, against this translation. For example, kataluma is the word that's used in both Mark and Luke. So now we're talking about how it's used in the New Testament. But it's used in both Mark and Luke for the private upper room where Jesus and his disciples ate the Last Supper. Meaning that here it's being used to refer to a reception room in a private home. And this is why some translations, like the NIV and the NRSV, use the words guest room when it comes to Luke 2:2. And when Luke himself refers to a public lodging, when he talks about an inn, like in the parable of the Good Samaritan, right, where the Samaritan comes upon the Jew who's been beaten up, he takes him to an inn, he pays for him to stay there, it's certainly an inn. The word that's used by Luke in the Greek is a more common word referring to a place where all travelers are to be received. Pandokaien is the Greek word. It literally means all receiving. You can think of the word pan, right? That prefix means all. Pandokaien refers to a place where everyone is to be received. And if you look at Greek lexicons, they essentially say that kataluma is the spare or upper room in a private house or in a village where travelers received hospitality and where no payment was expected. And padokaien is used for shelters concerning strangers in which you would have to then go and pay. And so kataluma, as we said, is the word that's used in Luke 2. So if you look at this kind of semantic evidence, it points to the idea that This is not an inn, but this is attached to someone's house. This is a private guest room that would be used for family, and you wouldn't charge to stay there. The second issue concerning the false narrative, the source of it, concerns a misunderstanding of the story's historical and social context. It's interesting, my family and I don't know if this is interesting, maybe it's not at all. Let's just transition stuff. But my family and I, this last weekend, went to Bethlehem Village, of course, right? They had the Christmas stroll in downtown Georgetown. We always go to Bethlehem Village, and we watched the play of the nativity scene. After which my wife asked me what I thought of it, and I said, the only thing that would make it better is if it were Jewish. Because the narrative was ridiculously Western. It was utterly foreign to ancient Judaism. There was even a politically correct speech where Joseph, opines how proud he is of Mary, that she's made this journey, and all of this stuff. In other words, anachronistic readings of this particular story abound, which to some extent is just going to be the case because the world we live in is very different than the one in the ancient world, and it's a very foreign world to us in many ways. But some of this anachronism is pretty wild, including what I witnessed at the Bethlehem Village. But going back to the story itself, the general story that's told about these events. In the first place, we'd want to say concerning the historical and social context of it is, and I get this from a scholar named Ian Paul. He says it would be unthinkable that Joseph, returning to his place of ancestral origins, would not have been received by family members, even if they were not close relatives. And he really gets this from Kenneth Bailey, who is an expert on first century Palestinian culture, who writes this. He says, even if Joseph had never been there before, he can appear suddenly at the home of a distant cousin, recite his genealogy, and he is among friends. Joseph had only to say, I am Joseph, son of Jacob, son of Mathan, son of Eleazar, son of Eliud. And the immediate response must have been, you are welcome. What can we do for you? If Joseph did have some member of the extended family resident in the village, he was honor bound to seek them out. Furthermore, if he did not have family or friends in the village, as a member of the famous house of David, for the sake of David, he would still be welcomed in almost any village home. And what I would add to that is that whether there was room for him or not, he would be welcomed. So this is the notion, of course, of Jewish hospitality or biblical hospitality, which we often think of as, when someone's willing to host a party at their house, which is a great thing to do, but it's nothing like the radical notion of hospitality that we find in Scripture, and that was present throughout the history of Judaism, including in the Second Temple period, which is the time of our story here. It's a radical willingness to offer shelter to anyone that's in your tribe. Indeed, it's the feeling that it's an obligation to do so. That's a matter of honor. Your honor is at stake if you were to turn away a stranger that shows up at your house. And the significance of this is perhaps best illustrated by Lot in this horrendous story that we read, that when the wicked men of Sodom demand that he turn over his two guests, right? So these are visitors, they're his guests. They demand for him to turn over his guests so that they can have their way with them. Lot offers them his daughters instead. Now this might be a sign of Lot's depravity, or perhaps he is just saying to these men, as one writer put it, I'll hand over my guests as soon as pigs fly, right? I mean, saying, oh no, take my daughters is, sarcasm to say, I'm not handing them over no matter what. There's no chance I'm handing over these guests. I'd rather die. Now, in the Christian conception of this kind of hospitality, the requirement is expanded, right? It's not just members of your tribe, but it's to everyone. Not only relatives, but to all. And so it's an eagerness to receive travelers into your home as family, to aid them in any way that you can, and to rejoice in doing so. Now, in our affluent society, the need for this kind of accommodation has been reduced significantly, of course. And what I'm afraid is that all of the blessings that come from such service and fellowship are also lost because of it. But in addition to this misunderstanding concerning hospitality, ignorance concerning the actual design of Palestinian homes has also allowed the perpetuation of the traditional narrative. Again, I quote from Ian Paul, who says, "The mention of a manger in Luke's nativity story, suggesting animals, led medieval illustrators to depict the ox and the donkey recognizing the baby Jesus. So the natural setting was a stable. After all, isn't that where animals are kept?" Now, as far as keeping animals, it certainly would have been the case in medieval times to keep them in a stable. The question is, would that have been what you normally did in first century Palestine? Again, in his book, Jesus Through Middle Eastern Eyes, Kenneth Bailey lays out the floor plan for the typical Jewish dwelling. Most families lived in a single room which had two levels to it. The lower level was for the animals, which would be brought in at night, and the upper level was for the family. This is the barn dominium that's on the first page of the handout. In addition, and this is on the second, there's a rough sketch to lay out this on the second page of the handout. In addition to this, there would be a guest room either on the back of the house or on the roof. So the area now where the animals resided would have hollows in the ground that were filled with straw from which the animals would eat, right? And they were referred to as, you guessed it, mangers. So as Paul argues, this living arrangement is also, if you look through Scripture carefully, if you look through the New Testament, you see it confirmed by several texts in the Gospel. For example, in Matthew 5:15, Jesus says, "Nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house." Now, this, of course, would make sense only if everyone is living in a single room, right? One lamp giving light to everything. That would only work if it's a single room. Similarly, in Luke's telling of the healing of the woman on the Sabbath, Jesus says this, "Doesn't each of you on the Sabbath untie your ox or donkey from the manger?" There's the same word as Luke 2:7. "And lead it out to give it water." So if you think about it this way, this is on the Sabbath. So these strict Jews are not going to go out to the outskirts to their stable to do this. What they are doing is leading the animals out of their house in order to get a drink. In fact, one late manuscript reads, "Lead out the animal from the house and give it water." That seems to be the sense of that particular verse. So given our now enlightened understanding of the Palestinians, the ancient Palestinian dwellings, I'm sure you never thought you'd know that, but now you know it, we have to then address the question of, okay, what does it mean then, this phrase that says there was no room for them in the kataluma, there was no room for them in how we're translating now as the guest house. There's no room. Well, it means that when Mary and Joseph traveled to Bethlehem for the census, the family guest room of their relatives was already full, occupied likely by other kinsmen who arrived earlier, which is not surprising given the large number of people traveling for the census, right? People traveling back to Bethlehem. So Joseph and Mary then had to stay with the family itself in the main room of the house, and this is where Mary gives birth. And as Ian Paul points out, the most natural place to lay the baby is in the straw-filled depressions at the lower end of the house where the animals are fed. And so the idea then that Joseph was going door to door looking for accommodation is not only unsupported in the text, it says nothing about it, but it seems very unlikely given the cultural context, especially considering the importance of hospitality among the Jews, as we said. Being of the lineage of David, Joseph could have likely gone to any home and received a welcome. To turn him away would have brought dishonor upon that family's house. Which means then that the home where Jesus was born very well may have been that of a near relative. Jesus likely came into the world among people who knew his family very well. And thus the idea that he was born in a stable, alone and outcast, shunned by his community, is both grammatically and culturally improbable. Indeed, if we go back to Kenneth Bailey one last time, he makes the argument that in the ancient world, it was hard to ever be isolated and alone, even if you wanted to be. He writes this: anyone who has lodged with Palestinian peasants knows that notwithstanding their hospitality, the lack of privacy is unspeakably painful. One cannot have a room to oneself, and one is never alone by day or by night. I myself often fled into the open country simply in order to be able to think. And this is not what we read of Jesus, right? He goes out into the wilderness, away from, the ever-presence of the people in order to pray, in order to focus his mind. And it's an experience, I think, that's very hard for moderns to grasp, because we spend so much of our time, especially in late modernity, alone. Even if we're not alone physically, we put in our earbuds and we are alone, right? People go grocery shopping, if they still go, with the earbuds in, and they're totally alone, even though they're surrounded by numerous people. Technology permits us to live ever more isolated lives. And as such, privacy is a huge thing to us. But this has not been the case for the vast majority of people who have come before us. And if you doubt this, you just have to visit any third world country. Those nations which lack the technological advancement required to permit that kind of independence. When I was in Zimbabwe, I often felt the suffocating effects of an extreme lack of personal space. Like there were people always all around me and very much violating my personal space. I had the unfortunate experience of traveling on a chartered bus once. And it was, it's like a clown car with the face pressed up against the glass, like this. We were cheek to cheek, and being claustrophobic as I am, of course, this was a thing of absolute nightmares. What's interesting about it, though, is people from Zimbabwe, when they come from that's what their normal is, they come here, they experience a similar kind of suffocation. But it comes not from there being so many people, but from the lack of people. That extreme isolation, they sense it and it suffocates them. I've seen numerous preachers come over who think of America as this shining light on a hill, and they can't wait to come here, and they come and they see all the prosperity and they want to move their family here and do all this stuff. But after being here for a few weeks, they say, no, I want to go home, forget it. Because it's so suffocating. They feel I'm totally isolated. I feel like I'm on a planet all by myself in this world. So all this to say that in the Christmas story, Jesus is not a refugee from his community. He is born in the midst of a family. And as many have argued, this should then fundamentally change our approach to enacting and preaching on the Nativity. And here's why. Because the place where Jesus was born matters in the story. Because it shapes how we understand the incarnation, which is the deeper meaning of the story. This is God becoming flesh and dwelling among us. This is Prince Emmanuel, God with us. As Dick France has put it this way. He said, the problem with the stable story is that it distances Jesus from the rest of us. It puts even his birth in a unique setting, in some ways as remote from life as if he had been born in Caesar's palace. Meanwhile, the message of the incarnation is that Jesus is one of us. He came to be what we are. And it fits well with that theology, that his birth, in fact, took place in a normal, crowded, warm, welcoming Palestinian home, just like every other Jewish boy of his time. All that to say that Jesus' humanity is not altered by his divinity. Jesus is fully human, just as he is fully God. His human nature and experience is exactly like ours. And it has to be that way. As the Hebrew writer says in Hebrews chapter 2, it has to be that way in order that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in service of God, and that he might make atonement for the sins of his people. Our intercessor had to become fully human. He had to be tempted in the same way that we are. In order for God to be sacrificed on the cross, he had to become man. And the story of the Nativity is meant in part to communicate that truth, that Jesus in his human nature is just like every one of us. Again, to say the myth here becomes fact. And we don't want the way that we tell the myth or the story to undermine the fact of the incarnation, even in a little bit. We must hold those two things together.